afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome in this plenary session, which is the BRAIBANT lecture. Before I pass the floor to the chairperson of this session, I would like that we have a word of remembrance for colleague Fabienne Marron, and I think the Director General, Sofiane Sahraoui, would like to say a few words before we play a video to pay tribute to her.
Ready? Je commence? Okay, so I'm not here, of course, to moderate or coordinate any of this, but I wanted to seize this opportunity to pay tribute to one of our deceased colleagues, Dr. Fabienne Marron, who unfortunately passed away at the end of last year. And of course, many of you know Fabienne. You will see in the video that we will share soon with you the extent of her contribution to this organization. We obviously, this is the first event after her death, and we do miss her quite a bit. I will not say much more because the video will tell the story of Fabienne and her involved with Iias. All what I wanted to say is that you know, we talk about strategy, we talk about so many things, etc. And actually, yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, or before yesterday, in the Council of Administration, we were debating a lot of things about the management of our organization. But you know, and throughout this meeting and this conference, we've been talking about grand strategies, etc. But sometimes you have people, when they're not there anymore, suddenly the whole organization goes off. And then strategies suddenly become not useful, especially in a small organization like ours. And so now we're contemplating a reorganization of the Institute, primarily as a result of the disappearance of this person. And this is just to tell you that there are some people, no matter how well you have a job description for them, they are at the core of the functioning of an organization. They are all over. They offer so much that is not always perceived correctly, or that, you know, it's not easy to put your hand on exactly what they do, to the extent that once they go, you have to redo everything. Obviously, maybe this is not the best way of managing an organization, but people, when they grow within organizations, sometimes they get to acquire a role that makes them, you know, core to an organization. Therefore, you have to completely reorganize as a result of their death. With this, I just wanted to pay tribute to this great person, you know, that is no longer with us. And with no further ado, and before we go on to the main item in this session, which is the BRAIBANT lecture that will be offered by our dear colleague Andrew Massey, I would like to play a video that kind of summarizes the life of Fabienne Marron. Of course, it'll be impossible, you know, to give her due credit, but at least we would like, you know, to celebrate her life or her legacy through this video and through this conference, which, you know, she's ever present with us. Steve, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Director General.
Today, we celebrate the life of Dr. Fabienne Marron, a brilliant scholar, mentor, and friend, whose passing on December 30, 2024, left a profound void. Her legacy endures in the institutions she helped to shape and the countless lives she touched. For over 24 years, she was a driving force behind Iias-Darpg, and Iias, expanding IIGP's influence, elevating its annual conference, and fostering global collaborations across Europe, the USA, and the MENA region. Her dedication ensured public administration remained a dynamic and inclusive field. More than a scholar, public service was her life. She built connections, inspired young minds, and strengthened global networks. Though deeply missed, her spirit lives on, guiding future generations in governance, education, and public service. Fabienne Marin was born in 1966 in Belgium, growing up in a family that valued both hard work and service. Her father, a former coal mining foreman who later became a bank director, and her mother, a dedicated nurse, instilled in her a deep sense of discipline and curiosity. She attended high school in Charleroi, following a curriculum in economic sciences with enhanced courses in French, Dutch, and English, with the clear goal of pursuing political science, a field she described as her calling. Fabienne completed her entire university education at the Université Catholique de Louvain-la-Neuve UCL, where she first earned a 2-year undergraduate degree in economic, social, and political sciences. She then pursued a licentiate in political science, specializing in international relations, followed by a master's degree in public administration. Her academic passion led her to further studies, obtaining a postgraduate diploma DEA and later a PhD in political science under the supervision of Professor Rudolf Reis-Sahesi. Her doctoral dissertation, The Triangular Concept of Political Project Situation, Meaning, Strategy, sought to provide a new conceptual framework for analyzing political change. She defended her thesis in December 1999, with the renowned French sociologist Raymond Boudon presiding over the jury. To finance her studies, Fabienne worked as a research assistant, contributing first to an external project and later to a UCL research group focused on Belgium's institutional future. Her commitment to academic research allowed her to develop expertise in public administration, governance systems, and European political structures, which later became the foundation of her career. Her ability to synthesize complex ideas, produce in-depth analyses, and engage with international perspectives made her a promising figure in the field. Just a few weeks after defending her PhD, she was approached by the International Institute of Administrative Sciences Iias to draft briefing notes. Initially joining as a volunteer in February 2000, she was officially hired in October of the same year, marking the beginning of a lifelong commitment to public administration and governance. This transition from academia to institutional leadership would define her legacy, as she seamlessly blended intellectual rigor with real-world policy engagement. Fabienne Marin quickly became a cornerstone of the International Institute of Administrative Sciences Iias, serving as Executive Secretary for the European Group for Public Administration IIGP and as Iias Scientific Director during her last years in the Institute. Her sharp analytical mind, commitment to knowledge dissemination, and ability to navigate complex institutional landscapes made her indispensable to Iias and its affiliated organizations. She played a key role in developing research programs, coordinating many global conferences, and advancing international collaboration in governance and public administration. In addition, she actively contributed to the International Review of Administrative Sciences (IRAS) and the International Association of Schools and Institutes of Administration (IASA). Through these institutions, she strengthened global academic networks, fostered public administration education, and helped shape governance discussions worldwide. Her efforts were recognized in 2022 when she was the recipient of the IASA Donald C. Stone Award. This award pays tribute to individuals who have made outstanding contributions to IASA. Her dedication extended beyond research and administration. Fabienne was instrumental in organizing transatlantic and trans-European dialogues, which became essential platforms for intellectual exchange between scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. She facilitated multilateral cooperation among universities, research institutions, and public administration professionals, ensuring that governance discussions incorporated diverse global perspectives. Her leadership was marked by inclusivity, innovation, and a deep commitment to bridging academic research with practical governance challenges. Beyond her professional achievements, Fabienne was a lover of the arts in all forms: music, painting, sculpture, architecture, international cuisine, and photography. She found inspiration in nature, relation with people, and reading during her spare time. Her passion for discovery and appreciation of culture enriched not only her personal life but also her approach to academic and professional work. Her ability to connect cultural depth with political insight was evident in her academic writing and policy contributions. Fabienne Marin's legacy lives on in the institutions she contributed to shape, the scholars she mentored, and the knowledge she contributed to the world of governance and public administration. Her life's work reflected an extraordinary blend of intellectual pursuit, institutional leadership, and humanistic curiosity, leaving an indelible mark on the field and on all who had the privilege of working with her. Fabienne's story is not just about professional achievements. It's about the warmth she shared, the friendships she nurtured, and the energy she brought into every room. She was the heart of our community. And following the heartbreaking news of her passing on December 30th, 2024, we now say our final farewell to our dearest Fabienne. Her presence enriched our world, and though she leaves us, her legacy will forever echo in the institutions and hearts she touched. The sea whispered its eternal lullaby as the winds carried the weight of our sorrow to the shore. The morning rain, heavy with grief, washed the earth in quiet reverence, yet as the hour of parting neared, the heavens relented, revealing a half-lit sky, a canvas of muted gold and soft grays, like a painting from an old Flemish master, tender in its melancholy. At the small cemetery of De Haan, where the dunes embrace the land and the waves never cease their song, we gathered, friends, colleagues, and those who had known Fabienne in the many seasons of her life. The hearse arrived from Le Van, its burden both solemn and beautiful, adorned with flowers sent from distant corners of the world, a testament to the hearts she had touched. A single photograph rested atop the casket, holding her gaze in a silent, eternal presence. There was no grand ceremony, no formal incantation, only the purity of human voices, speaking of love, memory, and loss. Words flowed like a gentle stream, a simple yet profound tribute, an affirmation that Fabienne would not be forgotten. A poem was read, hanging in the air like a fragile bird, hovering just long enough before dissolving into silence. A voice trembled with emotion, tracing the contours of her kindness, her laughter, her generosity. And we stood, motionless, as if time had paused in deference. One by one, we stepped forward, each placing a single red rose upon her coffin, a thoughtful gift, crimson against the polished wood, petals unfurling like whispered goodbyes. Moving with quiet grace, the undertakers signaled the final farewell, ushering us away as they prepared to return Fabienne to earth. We did not see the soil embrace her, did not witness the closing of the ground, but perhaps it was better this way, leaving her gently among the echoes of our love, rather than the weight of finality. By the entrance, we lingered, speaking in hushed tones, finding solace in one another's company. Some of us walked to the shore, to the vast horizon Fabienne had once loved, where the sea stretched without end, mirroring the expanse of our loss and remembrance. No bells tolled, no choir sang, only the wind through the dunes, the hush of the waves, and the unspoken vow that she would remain with us, carried in the quiet spaces of our hearts. Let us carry her memory forward, with the same passion, dedication, and kindness that defined her life.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Steve,
To another name.
I would like to recognize Cesar Afonso, who has prepared this video for us. He's the Executive Secretary of Asia, the International Association of Schools and Institutes of Administration, and of the Latin American Group Public Administration. He's not here with us today, but he has sent us this video so that we can share this moment with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So without transition, I would like to pass the floor to Hideaki Shiroyama, who is the chairperson of the IIS Scientific Committee, also known as PRAC. Professor Hideaki Shiroyama, the floor is yours.
Yes, Steve and Sophia, thank you very much. My name is Hideaki Shiroyama. I am a chair of the Program Research Advisory Committee, and I would like to chair this session. BRAIBANT lecture is an annual event in the annual conference of the IIAS in honor of Mr. BRAIBANT, a French bureaucrat who contributed a lot to the development of the IIAS as a platform for bridging the science and practice. This year, BRAIBANT lecture is awarded to Professor Andrew Massey. Andrew is the Emeritus Professor of the Government at the King's College London and was previously the founding director of the International School for Government at King's College from the 2019 to 2025. Prior to that, he was head of the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Exeter, UK, and Associate Dean in the Faculty of Social Science at the Exeter. He has worked on the various areas, including the British and the European and the US policy and politics. In addition to that, he did comparative research, comparative public policy research, and public administration, and issued around the reform and modernization of the government and governance. And he also involved in the practice in several sense. He also has been the extensive experience working in and with the UK civil service. At the community, he also worked as the Justice of Peace for 17 years. In IIAS, he was the editor-in-chief of the journal International Review of Administrative Science for the last 10 years until 2024, and also was a member of the Council of Administration of International Institute for Administrative Science. He was also the editor of the Public Money and Management for 10 years also until last year, 2024. His recent work seems to highlight several topics. The first topic I can think of is the importance of having broader cultural perspective in public administration. Based on his comparative analysis, he emphasized the broader scope to have non-Western public administration in mind is important. The second point I can think of is the emphasis on the necessity for the contemporary civil servant to have a capability to deal with the so-called wicked problem, including the capacity to work across the boundaries. The third point might be the unique nature of the research relevance in the field of the public administration, which is inherently multidisciplinary and bridging the research and practice. Research relevance in public administration cannot just be based on the narrow so-called research impact, focusing on the citation and so on. Thinking about those points, we think that we are very fortunate to have Andrew as a BRAIBANT lecturer at the annual conference held in India by the partnership with the Academic Society and the government, Ministry of the Administrative Reform and Public Grievances, focusing on the complex challenges such as digitalization and social inclusion. Today, Andrew will talk about the next generation of the administrative reform, empowering a citizen. This is a title which is basically exactly the same as the theme of the annual conference overall itself, only removing the reaching the last mile part. I'm not sure it has an implication or not. But anyway, we hope that Andrew's lecture will be exciting by itself. But in addition, the lecture will stimulate the discussion about the overall theme of the conference here in New Delhi. Andrew, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Professor Shiroyama-san. Appreciate your introduction. I'd just like to add, in terms of Fabienne, she was also one of the kindest people I ever met, so I think we should remember her kindness too. Next Generation of Administrative Reforms, Empowering Citizens. What a huge title. I won't be able to address it all. You'll be relieved to know. I've only got half an hour, not half a year. It is a great honour to have been invited to deliver the 2025 Guy BRAIBANT lecture, and I thank the organisers of IIAS for the opportunity. but also the Minister, Secretary, and our Indian hosts for their hospitality and kindness to us while we've been here. It is, however, a little daunting when you observe the full list of distinguished former speakers, a list full of outstanding practitioners and academics, not least of whom was Guy BRAIBANT himself, an impressive legal scholar and practitioner, as well as an administrator, writer, and at one time, Director General and then President of the IIAS. It is fitting that the lecture series has been named after him. And if you read the first lecture in this annual series, delivered by BRAIBANT, it is clear just how perspicacious he was and how he distilled many of the existing issues and trends. Things that we're looking at today still, we've explored in the series of lectures and papers that we've had this week, but that we see throughout public management and public administration and public policy around the world and on a regular basis. He projected forward his thinking on what has gone on, and we are still discussing those points. He was clearly looking toward the next generation of administrative reforms, as well as learning from the past, and that's what we have to do to understand the present. We need to know the past. He recognized the temporal nature of politics and policy. Unlike many French politicians and administrators of his generation, BRAIBANT was not seduced by the pretensions of the Anglosphere, of the Anglo-Saxons, to have reinvented politics, but sought to learn the lessons and harness them within a French and European context, and explore what global issues and what global lessons, if any, could be drawn. So today's lecture, we can learn from the work of successive speakers that the lecture series has taken a lead from IIAS and gone from being predominantly attuned to Western public administration and Europe to becoming global in its focus. BRAIBANT was given the title Past and Future Public Administration for his lecture. It is similar to this year's, which is ironic, given that he was looking ahead and now we're doing it again. And that's the function, I think, of good public administrators. Never sit still. Look forward the whole time to what is coming down the road, how we can shape it, how we can structure it, both as practitioners, politicians, and as academics. It is similar to the years in that he noted several things. Firstly, the need to recognize new technologies and how to apply them to public administration. And we've looked this week at artificial intelligence, and we've looked throughout the globe at the impact of the new technologies. And there are all kinds of task forces in the world and in government around the world looking at these. The need to recognize the singularity of different systems. What works in Chicago may not work in Cape Town for a variety of reasons, one of which is the past. We all live in a palimpsest. Things are rewritten and reinvented again and again. As the great observer of the human condition, the Anglo-Indian writer Ruskin Bond wrote, and I quote, "The past is always with us, for it feeds the present." End of quote. It is our interpretation of the past that changes and how we both imagine, reimagine, and celebrate certain parts of it. Now, BRAIBANT discussed many of those things, and we still obsess over these. For example, and on this list, I won't go into detail in all of them. It's a list we all have in our notes, in our training, and the training that we give to others. But key for BRAIBANT, because he was a lawyer, was the rule of law. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Honesty, transparency, efficiency. But of course, these things are discussed in different ways in different countries and at different times. We need to recognize the temporal, cultural, geographical, and political nature of public administration, understanding the relationships between political power and public administration, which emerges from this contextual mix. And again, this is a point I will come back to. It is key to understanding and forming the next generation of administrative reform. Subsequent BRAIBANT speakers, as well as those at political science and public administration conferences, speeches, training centres, workshops, over the last 3 decades have addressed these and returned repeatedly to public administration's role in supporting and protecting the rule of law, both on behalf of citizens and for the state and public service itself. So to summarise again some of these in a list slightly longer, the rule of law often comes top of this. We need to ask, what do we mean by the rule of law? Whose law? What law? Who makes the law? Who applies the law? Who interprets the law? Public service. What do we mean by public service? We've just heard a lovely eulogy for Fabienne, and in many senses she was a perfect example of public service, undemanding, selfless, always working for the good of others. And we look to see this in our public servants in whichever country we are in. Integrity, probity and impartiality. We want our public servants to be honest and truthful and impartial. In a sense, these are Weberian ideal types. We know not everybody is like this, but we want them to try and be like this. A need for flexibility. Things change, we need to change with them. So even though we have the same titles, and we may now still be talking about the data science and artificial intelligence, the kind of data knowledge and the data state and artificial intelligence that we'll have in even 2 years' time, let alone 20, will be very different. So we need to be flexible to deal with this. Recognise the interaction between politics and policies. All too often, we have a reliance on procedures, on regulations, and we forget the importance of politics. New forms of accountability. Citizen-centred services. What do we mean by those? This means something different in most countries. We heard this week about what citizen-centred services are in India. They mean something different in China and something different again in the United States. So what do we mean as public administrators? Can we have one view? Value for money. Well, of course, that's motherhood and apple pie. Nobody wants to be wasteful. Nobody ever got elected by saying, give me your taxes, I'm going to squander them. But what do we mean by value for money? A skilled and responsive service workforce. And we want to explore the assault on big government. The Honourable Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, former minister in South Africa, she notes that cuts and privatisation hollow out the state and therefore hollow out democracy from her perspective. So politics and economics are never far apart. But of course, as noted, all of these are context specific. And value for money and the rule of law mean different things in different places. The late, great Christopher Pollitt once observed, citing directly from the 2017 work of Wolfgang Dreschler, and I quote, "What we have called global public administration is actually Western public administration," close quote, and more particularly the Anglosphere. Yet he argued that what we are currently living through is the end of the domination of the Anglosphere in public management. And it is this I wish to take as one of the anchoring points of today's lecture. We will explore what could be the next generation of administrative reforms and ask how we could empower citizens. Now, for those of you who've kindly attended talks I've given over the last 2 years, there will be a recognition of some of my central points. Don't worry, I'm not going to go over all of them, but I want to try and bring them all together and to link it in to some of the work that's gone before. So what I seek to do here is to bring these into a coherent whole and address the main theme of this conference, empowering citizens. Obviously, there is much that I will need to leave out, but I intend to reference previous speakers and to lead off from where their insights have taken us. And as noted earlier, there's no time or space to conduct a global comparative analysis of the systems, so I ask your indulgence if I pick up a few illustrative examples to make some general points. First, what do we mean by empowering citizens? How do we define citizens? In many countries, undocumented migrants are not citizens, yet occupy that country's public policies and new public services. How can you gain citizenship? This is a big topic of conversation at the moment in the United States. What are the rights and duties of citizens? If you have rights, you obviously have duties. And what are those under the rule of law and the Constitution? what is the role of public administration in this? The view of the state has traditionally been very different in the US and British law and academia to that of France, China, or North America. One of the important things that the Americans did when they had their revolution was to have a Copernican inversion. They upended the view of the role of public administration. Previously, at the top of everything was the king, the emperor, the president, and then the people of various levels. What the American Revolution did and the American Constitution does is have at the very top, we the people of the United States, and all public servants serve them, which led President Ronald Reagan to say the problem of government is government, taking a very different view to that which we find in many other countries. Ought public administration itself to be representative? Representative of whom? Representative of different groups in society, representative of gender, representative of linguistic groups. The view of the state takes us to think of ourselves, well, who are we representing? Who are we serving? And there's a lot of work on this, the work of Van Ryzen, Rikuchi, Johnston, Meyer, amongst many others, and many kinds of contested representation. Does one person's representation, one person's rights, trump another person's rights? And as Sebastian Jelkes said, what clients of government are deserving of help? Prisoners are clients of government. People who've committed terrible crimes are clients of government. Obviously, in a civilized society, we treat them with humanity, but how much help should we give them? You will observe the title of the talk, and the notion of empowering citizens, therefore, is a contested entity. And that's before we get on to the relative roles and relationships between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary and judges. A fluid, ever-shifting series of interactions. Now, as someone who's been a member of the executive of my own country's government and a lecturer for many years, decades, I always often ask, what is the role of judges? They're just lawyers. They haven't been elected to anything. A lawyer is there to deal with buying and selling of houses or dealing with criminals. What have they got to do with dealing with politically active people who've been democratically elected? So does the rule of law mean the rule of lawyers and judges? If so, where does that leave democracy and the accountability of those judges? So context is the key to understanding and to effective action. Let's begin with East Asia. Pan Soo Kim, in his BRAIBANT lecture, and a range of subsequent politicians, has argued that East Asian public administration research is going beyond the current academic achievements built upon Western PA theories and practices. And that's largely because of the evolving political systems in East Asia. And he also argues that much of East Asian, and in particular Chinese work, predates Western public administration, sometimes by millennia. The East Asian academic community is making additional synthesizing efforts in recognizing its own Asian context and is building its own theory and considering its own characteristics, quite separate to, but not isolated from, Western public administration. It is contributing to new theories based on universal values of the rest of the world, but from a particular East Asian perspective. Chinese academia, for example, the work of Yu, has argued that we need to understand new areas of research, such as emergency management, and this is spread across into the most recent work of Japanese academics. Performance evaluation, e-government, these are Western public administration, but they're being taken that bit further very often in China, Japan, and Korea, and Singapore. Service-orientated government, social policy, and urban management. Now, Kim cites other authors such as Ogden's proposal that there are three basic competing values that underlie many decisions of the Chinese government. One is traditional Chinese culture, two is socialism, and three is development. Now, Kim argues, as the political fashions change, the priority assigned to these values also changes. The three values are often shifting in priority and interpretation. And this depends on how much further they advance Chinese rulers' goals. In China, for example, the Communist Party. Merit-based recruitment and selection rests comfortably within traditional Chinese value, but a purely merit-based civil service may challenge the socialist value of ideology over expertise. And if we flip back a minute to representative bureaucracy, to what extent do we overrule merit-based admission, selection, training, recruitment and promotion in order to meet the needs of representation of different groups in society? I would argue we haven't yet even begun to address these conundrums and these problems. So argues Kim, the development of Chinese civil service reform in the future will reflect such shifting values and the power over the years. His most recent paper, published in this last year, brings home the fluid nature of political and cultural influence here. The merit-based system of recruitment evolved in China over many centuries and predates the European use of merit-based recruitment by at least 3 centuries. I say at least, it may be many, many more centuries. Indeed, it was the East India Company, and in particular, Thomas Babington Macaulay, who introduced a Chinese influence version of the merit system, first to India, where traditional Indian approaches probably modified it, and then to Britain, and from there to the United States, and then from the United States to much of the rest of the world. It wasn't linear, it took place piecemeal. But if we are honest and trying to understand where the influences come, we can see that the world we're living in as public administrators is heavily influenced by all that has gone before us and much of the rest of the world. Chinese influence not only travelled west, but also east, with Kim noting its impact on Japan and Korea, and subsequently their public administrations. For example, as I've noted earlier, the importance of historical perspectives on modernization, the bureaucracy and civil service systems, and increasingly in China, Korea and Japan, and Singapore, the importance of work on aging populations and the social welfare policy in a mature society where the aging population is rapidly becoming the largest section and will be so in some countries within our lifetimes or that of our children and grandchildren. Now, Kim has observed that the merit-based system around the world has led to government staffed by elite public officials because the people you appoint on merit tend to have gone to the best universities. And it's facilitated the rise of a strong administrative state, but the question of whether it did necessarily improve the quality of democracy in both Korea and Japan remains. Moreover, the advance of the developmental state has helped expand capitalism in both countries, while both governments have spearheaded the post-war economic growth in their respective countries. China, although in a different political system, may eventually face a similar problem as both Japan and Korea have. China's capitalistic socialism would enhance the power of bureaucracy and contribute to the development of state-controlled economies. However, the question of whether such rapid expansion would enhance democratic values remains. Overall, Kim argues, Japan and Korea are advancing scientific research in the field of public administration. China is also moving quickly to an advanced level in such areas. And these 3 nations, plus Singapore, lead in a number of areas, including agile delivery of public services. But given the title of this conference and this paper, we need more evidence of this. People may argue this is happening, but we do need the evidence. Work in China and Korea and Singapore on digital government and citizen access gives some clues as to how this may be developed. And I suspect it will be developed differently in each of those societies. Over many years, and I have a section of the talk now taken from Christopher Pollitt's work. Over many years and a large number of publications, Christopher Pollitt wrestled with these questions and sought to establish the nature of the dominance of Western public administration that he claimed is now in decline. He argued Western public administration was founded on the role and control of certain key institutions, such as the Bretton Woods organizations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank. And these were built upon with the work of the United Nations, the OECD, and American money, beginning with the Marshall Plan and huge amounts of American aid around many parts of the world ever since. Now, these were sources and carriers of key ideas and practices. They were, he argued, centered in leading business schools, nearly all of which, to begin with, were American, and institutional management consultancies, most of which in the beginning were American, although these have now spread much wider globally. And also by intergovernmental bodies such as the OECD and certain units at the centres of national governments in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. This network created a process by which practices turned into models that are distant and disconnected from time to time and rendered general, and that's the important point, they're rendered general. They're taken out of their cultural, social, and political context. They're simply institutions, they are things. In short, universities, global NGOs, the World Bank, etc., and major consultancies all gave similar advice to states' leadership regarding establishing institutions and delivering services and change. These were centered on what at one time was called New Public Management, but it's really a form of managerialism. And the things such as privatization, co-creation, digital government, and we see the impact of this homogenization in the rollout of what came to be known as I say, New Public Management, but I think we were better to call it managerialism. We also see how damaging it was when introduced into some societies that were simply not structured in terms of public administration and governance for these reforms. In the former Soviet Union, for example, and several African and Latin American countries, the implementation of this new managerialism did enormous harm, partly because the elite, the leadership, the political class were not prepared for it. And in some cases, such as Russia, it led to outright theft of many of the state's resources and the growth of the oligarchs. Where it does appear to be a success, for example in Singapore, Malaysia, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, it was because although the labels remained the same, privatization and executive agencies, co-production, etc., the context was given a decidedly local interpretation. One size does not fit all. Pollitt argued that public sector organizations were increasingly seen, therefore, not in specific functional and technical terms, an agency, for example, for issuing driving licenses, but simply as organizations in general, and therefore entities that were open to the abstract application of managerialist models from the business schools. And these, he argued, were led by a process of abstraction and decontextualizing. And that's the point. You decontextualize public service from the people it's serving, from the government, from the citizenry. And this allowed management to be seen as the answer to an increasingly wide series of organizational and political problems. And you could bring in, within the Anglosphere and its diaspora, generic models and techniques that management consultancies, the big four, and probably an increasing number now, could then give you an off-the-shelf service that would give you solutions to your problems. Therefore, as a government, you didn't need to do the research. You didn't need to argue your points. You'd simply say, look, this is best value. This is what they're doing in America. This is what they're doing in Sweden. This is what they're doing in Australia. Therefore, if we copy it, we'll be good too. This, I would argue, after Pollitt, was a profound mistake. So, governmental organizations, and more importantly, intergovernmental organizations, like the OECD and the World Bank, produced reports which legitimized these ideas, implying more or less universal stages of development. And it's argued that these needed to be passed through. There was a very influential 1995 OECD report which listed the stages that countries have to go through in order to be considered developed. And it was especially influential. And a number of central governments set up central units to promote reforms in the name of efficiency and effectiveness, quality, or just modernization. And national officials found they could make useful careers out of such reforms. Management consultants and a good number of academics clung to the generic bandwagon, suggesting that certain types of reform were global trends and that traditional bureaucracies had now become severely dysfunctional. Now, Pollitt argued this was a mistake. The idea of generic global solutions was formidable, but it was wrong. It caused enormous harm in the former Soviet Union, and its alleged successes in other countries were, again, often unrealized. Take, for example, the case of Africa. Just one example, the privatization of Kenya Airways. The Kenyan academic and former minister, Professor Peter Onyong, argued that the last thing that Kenya needed was the kind of reform that enabled people to steal from society. Ghana, the Ghanaian academics, argued the same. And they looked north at Russia and they said, we don't want those kinds of reforms. We want reforms that are going to enrich our people, assist our people, empower our people, not disempower and impoverish them. And indeed, for a time, Ghana refused to accept this kind of advice and this kind of help. So what we can see is both the prestige and the external gain involved in the exports of these programs were much overrated, because the dominance of Western political administration, public administration, was never global or absolute. It was largely an illusion. China, India, and other nation states, and some of the Latin American countries, are increasingly important voices in the international public administration community. And in many cases, they have strong administrative cultures and traditions of their own. Pollitt again draws on the work of Drechsler to give one spectacular example. None of the Anglosphere states could claim to have a major treatise on civil service organization written more than 1,000 years ago. But Wang Anshi's text Wan Yanshu dates from 1058. As Pollitt argues, for these reasons alone, these countries are less and less likely to buy into the latest ideas from the Anglosphere. Therefore, as more information becomes available about the failures of Western public administration's reforms, fewer countries will adjust their public administrations according to those. As I've noted, they may borrow, but if they do, they will heavily adapt and translate or transform, all in themselves processes of indigenous innovation. Of course, they will continue to send fact-finding delegations to Anglosphere and other states in order to see what is happening, but that will not imply any belief that they have to copy what they see there. Alternatively, they will develop solutions of their own throughout the globe to these problems which they see most pressing and which are unlikely to be very similar to those found to be most urgent in Western Europe or North America. Chung may well be understating his case when he comments that there are doubts as to whether the multifarious problems and structural paradoxes confronted by China could be heavily tackled by transplanting Western concepts and practices, and we could apply that to any number of Latin American and Asian countries. Where Western influences may appear to be fairly plain, the actual ideas and practices may have been adapted in their new context, and in the context of this talk, may be coming back to the Anglosphere, having been refined. For an example, China has introduced a range of evaluation of the impact of its policies from the perspective of the citizen, or the adoption of executive agencies in the Korean civil service, now coming back to be re-examined in the West. Interestingly, other cultures may permit the successive approaches which would work much less well in the UK or the USA, as I said earlier in this lecture. Context, in all its manifestations, is everything. So what is to be done? The OECD, in exploring ways of recruiting, organising and training public servants, appears to have not moved far from the patterns and models of Western public administration. And in a similar vein, the UK civil service, amongst others, has continued to reform according to the kind of managerialist dynamics I've just outlined. There is much talk of good governance and best practice, though the phrase now, the preferred term, is good practice. But what is good government? The Council of Europe defined good governance with 12 traits. Again, this is motherhood and apple pie. There's not a politician went to an election saying they weren't going to follow the rule of law, they weren't going to be ethical. I mean, they may not be ethical, some of them, but they weren't going to go to elections claiming that. Nobody's going to say we're not going to innovate. Nobody's going to say we're going to have unsound financial management. Nobody's going to say we're going to be unaccountable. So these 12 traits are fatuous. Yet the Council of Europe and other organisations, the OECD, have various versions of these that they tout around the world as saying this is how you get good government, this is how you should reform your public administration. Rubbish. Why would you do that without putting some flesh on the bone, without actually saying, what do you mean by rule of law? And as I said at the very start, that's quite a difficult concept to define and to understand and to get agreement on. I'll come back to accountability in a minute. For the most part, these 12 traits are rooted in Western public administration and do not draw upon non-Western public administration, that each of these traits can be interpreted in non-Western ways. The OECD's reports in recent years have also focused on leadership for reform, not innovation in the sense that Cattell, Dressler and Caro analysed in their recent, very innovative book on why innovation needs bureaucracy. It is more of a harking back to old-style German cameralist approaches, often aligned with modern managerialism. So, there's a focus on leadership capabilities, skills, competencies, behaviour styles that are necessary to respond to complex policy challenges. The policies, processes and tools needed to develop these capabilities and support senior civil servants in using them are part of this package that are touted. In the UK, there are new professional standards attempting to address these concerns. I urge you not to try and interpret the right-hand side there, because I'm going to make a comment about it in a minute. The Central Civil Service in the UK has been restructured into the policy profession, which supports the government in its role in improving the welfare, security and prosperity of the nation, and the operational delivery profession. This is the public face of the civil service. These are the people who take your taxes and give you welfare. These are the people who are in charge of the police, the local government. In the UK, there are 250,000 members of the central government civil service in the operational delivery profession. The policy professionals are concerned with strategy, they solve problems and improve outcomes, work collaboratively with other professions. They're concerned with building democracy. Policy professionals have a key role to play in ensuring democratic accountability, working effectively with different levels of government to make policy that works for citizens. And they're concerned with effective and efficient delivery. Now a confession. There's a tradition for these BRAIBANT talks to later be published in the International Review of Administrative Sciences. I'm looking at the editor-in-chief here, hoping that she's still smiling. I will not put the next paragraph into the article. My confession is that I've been researching and teaching this stuff to UK civil servants. I've been involved in this stuff as a UK civil servant. I've been trying to structure some of these things for the last few years and had an input into it. And I can't quite follow all these changes and structures myself. It's absurd. It's like a bowl of spaghetti, all these different things are ravelling up. I know the reason behind it is to say, well, policy is different to delivery. Well, not really. I've had several permanent secretaries say to me, why don't these policy people go and look at what we do to delivery? And several delivery people say, why don't these policy people understand the difficulty of delivering these services, and then they go and structure functional professions, planning, inspection, etc., etc. So each of these functional professions are also members either of the policy profession or of the delivery group. I'm not going to go any further. You can see the absurdity of it. It's impossible to follow these things. It's impossible to manage, and it's impossible to hold them to account. I once interviewed a chief constable in a large police force, and I said to him, what are your performance indicators, your key performance indicators? And he was waiting for me. He had a board up there. He said, these. He clicked a button and there were 4. Solving crime, preventing crime, reporting crime, and there was one other, I forget what it was. I said, well, that seems fair enough to me, Chief. He said, yes, it is, if that's all we had to do. But I've also got to do these to the local authorities. And he pushed his button. Another 15 came up. He said, and these for the Home Office, pushed his button. And for another one, and another one, and another. He ended up with 78 key performance indicators. I said, what do you do? He said, I do the ones I can meet and then say we've succeeded. That's not public sector reform. That's tick-boxing for targets. And this will lead to the same sort of thing. It is, I would argue, therefore, overly complex and will need to be simplified and streamlined. In other countries, we have similar consultancy-induced complexity. It does seem, though, that the current reforms in the United States, as introduced in the last 2 weeks, are rather a dramatic way of trying to reform public administration. I don't know if you're following what's going on in the United States, but every morning I wake up and think to myself, what have they done now? We've seen that in many countries, government is no longer the employer of choice. States are facing human resource challenges among a host of other challenges because demographics in many leading countries have led to falling birth rates. And it's also, not just in the developed countries, but they then suck in skilled immigrants from the rest of the world. And that depletes the expertise, the so-called brain drain, in those countries. Again, to give you just one example, currently most of the nurses working in the UK health service and in much of the German health service and in much of the Canadian and in much of the Australian health service are not native to those countries. They're from the Philippines. They're from Botswana, they're from South Africa. At one stage, Britain was paying money to train nurses in Botswana and South Africa and then employing them directly into the National Health Service. So that means we got skilled nurses trained cheaply through the pretense of foreign aid. Is that fair? Is that fair to those countries? Is it fair to the home countries, when it should be producing our own skilled workforce? I don't know the answer to that. I'm just an academic. I have no answers of my own. I simply read books and then tell you what I've read. But I would argue that, in a sense, that kind of shifting around of responsibility, that avoidance of accountability for delivering services, is something that is probably not going to end well, and it's not gone well for the last generation while we've been doing it. Millennials' values and attitudes form different expectations about work. Lots of people say rude things about the millennial generation, saying they're lazy, they don't want to do this, they don't want to do that. Actually, they've taken the view that they have a perspective on work and expectations that is different from their parents. Every generation does the same. But it's hard to recruit them into the public service when there are long hours, hard work, and low pay. So there's a war for talent. Much of that goes beyond borders. So there are difficulties in attracting and recruiting competent personnel, fewer applicants, increased vacancies. And there's reduced interest because of these poor working conditions, low salary, and the retirement of the baby boomer generation. Many public sector organisations around the world have a poor bureaucratic reputation. Not all. There are workload burdens and stress, and neoliberal reforms. People don't like working in restructured institutions undergoing constant restructuring. Many of the issues facing governments around the globe may be described as wicked problems. There is no space to discuss this fairly well-trodden approach here, but to ask, what to do about them. These are pointing towards the next generation of administrative reforms that are coming over the horizon. The Australian Public Service Commission has spent a lot of time working on this, and they've decided there is no such thing as a wicked problem, only problems we haven't found the solution to yet. And they argue we need to be holistic, not partial or linear thinking. Innovative and flexible approaches, for example, blur the traditional distinction between policy development and program implementation. We need to work more across agency boundaries. We often hear about silo syndrome and departmentalism. It exists. I mean, we've all worked in organizations that do that, where your biggest enemy is not someone in another country, it's the office next door who are after your resources. And this governs so much of how we understand the dynamics of reform. But I think the key to this is effectively engaging stakeholders and citizens in understanding the problems and in identifying possible solutions. Does the future involve more incorporation of citizens into making and delivering policy? And if so, how can we structure this? Much of Rod Dakeham's work, for example, explores effectively engaging stakeholders and citizens in understanding the policy problems at street level, to use that old 1960s and 70s phrase, and then identifying possible solutions. And we can use theories by, amongst others, Carol Pateman and Ah Cheong-Fong to incorporate deliberative and participatory democracy. Using a range of these theories, we can see there are three broad justifications for increasing citizen participation. First, much of the literature suggests that participation should be valued because it is inherently good. It provides a set of democratic benefits which are better for society than if policy decisions were made by officials in isolation. I don't know if that's true, but you see it in a lot of the literature. And certainly it suggests that if you've got participation and people buying into those developments early on, then that's a good thing. The United Nations Annual Innovation Awards, for example, select a range of these each year to showcase precisely these kinds of initiatives. And the work of Flemish public policy academics at the University of Ghent, led by Professor Bram Verscheur, have engaged in impactful research in terms of giving access to make policy and deliver services to the elderly and excluded groups. Second, citizen control over policy. The notion that participation increases the ability of citizens to control actions in government and focus policies decisions on the most important areas. So this is about transparency and accountability. And finally, education. This one always comes up. By engaging in policy, citizens become more knowledgeable, both of the particular areas they're involved in and the mechanics and practicalities of government. Now, again, I'm going off track here, and I won't put this into the final one. Quite often, if you go out and ask people, as those of us who've been involved in this do, what do you think we should do about X? What do you think we should do about this problem in transportation or schools? Citizens will say, I don't know. You're the expert, you tell me. So what do you want? Well, I don't know, I haven't really thought about it. And you can push them, and then you can actually suggest things to them. That's not participation, that's leading them along. And there's a lot of work being done at the University of Utrecht with various people. They talk about diploma, diploma democracy. And when you ask, what is that? They say, well, you can really only understand these things if you've been to university and even got higher levels of diplomas. And if you don't do that, you can't participate fully as a citizen. So with an educationally unequal society, we're already excluding groups of people who are often already excluded. So this participatory democracy isn't really democracy, it's participation of elite groups, which is fine. But then how do you get the other people who you really want to reach involved? And that's a lot more work, and the work of Carol Pateman and Ah Cheong-Fong are quite useful in trying to do this. So you can see from this, we are wrestling with the notion of accountability and within the policy process, public administration. Now there are different kinds of accountability, and I've put them up on the board there. there's answerability or explanatory accountability. That's what we get in parliaments, in Congress. I was watching the finance debate in the Indian parliament yesterday, and people were asking questions and ministers were answering. That's answerability. You ask a question, you expect it to be answered. That's all it is. You're asking for information. You're saying, why did you do this? How are you going to do that? And the senior executives, ministers, secretaries of state give you an answer. There's a mandatory accountability. You change bad things. If that questioning leads you to discover something that is wrong or bad, then you change it. But that's where it is. So you say, well, we've had a problem in dealing with social security payments. This happened in Australia and in the Netherlands. But we found a way to cure it. We're going to pay people back the money, and there we are. They'll all be fine. You have redress of grievance. You put right wrong things. And that's very closely linked to a mandatory accountability, but it's a stronger version of it. And finally, you have sanctions. You punish the poor. The poor behavior of certain people. Of these, redress of grievance before the granting of supply is the most profound and ancient in terms of written law. Now, nobody was harmed in the taking of this photograph. It's an actor. It's a German actor pretending to be a Saxon Englishman being filmed in Hungary defending England against Danes. You see, there was a united Europe many years. He's playing Uhtred, son of Uhtred, an English earl, a Saxon earl. Why am I giving you a sudden lesson in ancient history when we've been talking about modern things? I will tell you. Redress of grievance before the granting of supply is the most ancient in terms of written law in the Anglosphere and much beyond. For example, when the Saxons came out of the German forests, and there were also Dutch forests because the Saxons were both Dutch and, in modern terms, Dutch and German, they didn't have kings. They didn't like kings. They were profoundly violent and profoundly opposed to being told what to do by anyone. And if their leader, and they later became called earls, if their leaders wanted them to form a band and to fight, and either to defend or attack, and if they wanted to get grain, and if they wanted more warriors, then the local people would form a witan, and they would say, you must address our grievance first. You must right our wrongs before we give you what you want, which in those days would be slaves, money, warriors, grain. Later on, it became taxes. And that became the foundation of modern Anglo-Saxon democracy, the redress of grievance before the granting of supply. It goes all the way back to before the foundations of England over 1400 years ago. But it was a foundational element in the US War of Independence. The Americans not only said no taxation without representation, which seems fair, but they also said, before we grant you taxes, before we give you money, you must address our grievances. And we will not supply money until you've redressed those grievances. And in the American Congress, to this day, there are supply days. And in the UK Parliament, to this day, there are supply days. In the Australian, New Zealand, South African parliaments, South Africa's got a slightly different name, but these are supply days. So before we grant you taxation, before we grant you money, you must tell us what you've done with the money before, and you must tell us what you're going to do with this money. And by the way, we don't like what you've done over this, this, and that. So you must tell us. And this is spread throughout many other societies in the world. It structures the relationship between politics and the administrative state, between the legislature and the executive, between citizens and government. It is the infrequently discussed core of good government, and it is central to reform, and recognizing that relationship is central to reform. And so, what we have is the need to understand where we are and to plan for the future through three words. Penumbra. A penumbra is the shadows and shading between light and dark. Very few things are binary. Nothing's either right or wrong. Nothing either works or doesn't work. Everything is in the shadows, and we need to cut a path through the shadows to find reform. I mentioned this word earlier, and I'll repeat it. Palimpsest. Nothing in society begins on a plain piece of paper or vellum. So we look at old laws, and they're written in one way. And what happened in the olden days throughout much of the world is paper and vellum was in short supply and very expensive. So the next lot of clerks and judges and lawyers who could write would then turn the paper over and write across it, and then turn it over and write on the back. So you had laws and customs overwritten again and again, and we're like that. We're like that still. Our society is like a palimpsest. You can't understand everything within 1,000 miles of where we are today in this room without understanding what's happened in the last 2,000 years around this room, and every other room in every capital city in the world. As I said at the very beginning, the Anglo-Indian author said, the past is always with us. It feeds the present. Egregore. This is more than a paradigm. It is a collective mind of a community within which paradigms, data, customs, law, and history are understood. It's how we think. So if you want to play mind game, I occasionally do this with my students. I won't do it with you. It would be patronizing. But I occasionally say to them, if I give you the word police officer, what do you think? And depending on where they've come from, they think of a man in uniform with a gun and a club, or they think of someone who helps them, rather like a social worker. It's the same two words, the same thought processes, but very different from the background and understanding and culture of those individuals. And you can do this with all kinds of things. But let us give the last word to Christopher Pollitt. Now, this is taken from a letter Christopher wrote to me just before he died. And with his permission, I published it after his death. And it was after he'd agreed that we could call our best article in Iias after him, the Christopher Pollitt Prize, the Christopher Pollitt Award for the best article. And he wrote, my aim in this letter is to say something about the field of scholarship in which I have spent 3/4 of my adult working life. My belief is that in parts of Europe, at least, it is in some peril, and that we have a role to play. An EGPA survey was carried out and showed that a strong majority of public administration scholars believe both in the scientific study of the subject and in its values and ethic of improved services for citizens from respected, well-trained and well-remunerated public servants, as do I. Yet today we face a rising populism, nationalism and racism. The authority, expertise and impartiality of civil servants is under attack on all sides. But what we see in academic public administration is too often a retreat into scholasticism, or at the other extreme, a kind of highbrow management consultancy. Of course, we need both these types, but we also need a solid core of public administration scholars who practice independent, high-quality, critical analysis of big things which are happening now and will happen in the future. Climate change, demographic change, migration. Scholars who will build and find funding for ambitious projects aimed at those issues, simultaneously growing networks of concerned scholars across disciplines and fields. And most importantly, who communicate, not only in learned journals, but on websites and blogs, radio and TV, and to the press. Many citizens really are interested in why their schools are failing or their police are corrupt, far less so in what celebrity politicians said to each other yesterday. We should be a respected voice that addressed to that appetite. End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, I should finish here because I don't think I could put it any better than Christopher. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for reminding us at the beginning the basis of the BRAIBANT lecture by BRAIBANT himself, talking about the past and present of the public administration and try to understand the context and practicing that after several decades under the current context. Thank you very much for the contribution. And we'd like to take several questions, but before that, I'd like to make one question. And that's about you have to say the relationship between the contextualization and also the decontextualization in the study of the public administration. At the beginning, you have been emphasizing that it is important to understand the context, the time context and the regional context, or even the organizational context, policy or operation, something like that. That's one thing. But on the other hand, you are also saying that a few times you mentioned that the decontextualization is also important.
Yes.
Maybe some work of the OECD or some Australian attempt to characterize the necessary current capabilities, kind of activity. So, so in case, how those two are related, and maybe in the context of the decontextualization, what's the challenge for that? Maybe now there is many argument about the nature of the Indian public administration or Chinese or Japanese and Korean and so on. But just pinpointing the existence of those, the variety, that's not the end in the final place. Based on that, it have to be a process to decontextualize based on wider things. Yeah. So what's the kind of challenge would be? And in that context, for example, 2 years ago, we had a BRAIBANT lecture, the Professor Huck of the Singapore National University, and he talked about the developmental states. So this is one of the experiment to decontextualize the kind of more wider experiences. And how do you think about that?
That's a very good point. Thank you, Hideaki. The decontextualization was when Christopher Pollitt and others were talking about the role that the major universities, business schools, and consultancies said all big organizations and institutions are the same or very similar. Therefore, we can apply these particular rules and goals to them. And that took them out of their context of their society. Now it's very clear, obviously you're a professor in Tokyo, that the Japanese perspective and context is enormously different to Brazil, for example. But you cannot, so therefore you cannot treat Japanese public sector organizations the way you would treat Brazil or Papua New Guinea or any that. You have to recognize where these organizations sit in terms of their culture, position, etc. So that the big business schools that were making a lot of the running in the 1950s, 60s and 70s and early 80s with privatization and what became known as new public management, were taking public sector organizations out of their context and saying, you need to run them like this. You need to reduce resources given to all kinds of things that can be privatized and sent to the private sector. The private sector can do these things much more efficiently. Now, in some cases, that may well be true, and we can all think of examples where it is. But in many other cases, and Russia is the most egregious example of that, all you did was take public sector monopolies and hand them to private sector groups who became oligarchs. And so if you recontextualize and put them back in the society from which they were taken, then you can get a better understanding of their role in society and really what they should be doing as public sector organizations and public servants.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, any question or comment? Okay, so I'd like to take the two questions first, then ask. So the first thing after that.
Thank you very much for a brilliant lecture. We heard with rapt attention what all you said. Next generation administrative reforms empowering citizens. I take two lessons from what you said. One is improving key result areas. The tick boxing has to be eliminated. But how do you do it when we try to formulate it? Have you seen the same police chief you met? Has he tried to streamline the tick boxing effort? The second one, redressal of public grievances. You had many slides on redressal of public grievances. How do you find the British system where grievances are being redressed? And has accountability levels increased with the redressal of public grievances, the focus that's being accorded to it?
Thank you. Those are extremely good and therefore hard questions to answer. To take your second question first on has accountability increased in the UK? Probably not. The moving of several things out of the democratic framework has put them beyond direct accountability, and the judicialization of decision-making and the role of judges is one of the things that has led to that. Everything that ministers put forward now is open to judicial review, and you will have citizens and groups of citizens saying, well, we voted for what the government have done. We didn't expect judges to tell us we can't do that. So that's one area that's become very open to conflict at the moment. I don't know how it will finish. But as a former civil servant, I hope it ends with the success of democracy. Sorry, what was the first question? The tick boxes, yes, thank you, yes. The police chief did clear his tick boxes because they sacked him. Which is why I didn't tell you which force it was. He was very vocal in his opposition to tick boxes and would tell people, this isn't solving crime, this isn't catching criminals. So he left by, well, they say mutual consent. Whenever you say mutual consent, you know it's probably not so mutual. The way you get rid of those tick boxes is to stop being obsessed with very small things to measure. Now, the business schools tell you that which can be measured can be managed. Actually, it's far more complex than that. And we need to look at the outcomes. What do we want as an outcome? And stop measuring small things. Now, yes, you can have low-hanging fruit, and yes, you do need to count some things, the number of crimes that have been solved, for example, in the case of the Chief Constable. But what is the outcome? Are people safer? And I have whenever I go to another country or another city even, I have a very clear tick box in my own mind about whether it's safe to walk around. If I see lots of elderly women walking around on their own, I know the area is safe. If I don't, then I start looking over my shoulder. And you've got very clear observation. You can't get a tick box in that. You can't have the police officers going out counting elderly women. So, oh, look, we've got 50% of them, therefore the area is safe. It doesn't work that way. You can't put these things in a tick box. Some of these things are cultural, and you have to get the kind of response that you ask people when you put together some fairly complex questionnaires, citizens' juries, that kind of thing, which I think are more effective than simply saying, oh, good, we've done these. Tick boxes, that's a Soviet style of working. How many brown pairs of shoes can you make in a year? Your target is, it's 4 million. Well, if you make them all of size 5, then you'll hit your target. But if you do it to meet everybody, then you won't hit your target. So nobody's better off, but you've hit the target.
Thank you. So the gentleman over there. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Massey, for your wonderful lecture. I have a very fundamental question to raise. In my understanding, if you see the whole administrative history, it is the administration which has been trying to prove its relevance in some way or the other. So, in the name of the public good, for instance, or in the name of the good, doing good to the citizens, even if you look at the citizen-centric approach of the government, for instance, or citizen empowerment, for instance, is it not the government itself is trying to prove its relevance?
If I've understood your question correctly, I think it's both those things. If you're in a time of crisis or you have an emergency, then the government must do these things. You can't stop a response to a crisis. COVID was an example, although perhaps not a good example, but a military crisis or an earthquake, something like that, you can't stop it and have a citizens council. But I think if you're planning some long-term changes, it makes a lot of sense to have a citizens' jury on reform of education system. What do parents want? What do the children want? What do employers want? A much wider consensus can be built with participative delivery. At King's, for example, for the last few years, we've had co-building, co-development and co-delivery of services to the civil service. And traditionally, what UK universities have done is to say, we've got this wonderful postgraduate degree, all your people should go on it. And it teaches them how to be better civil servants. All the things you've just mentioned are involved in this. And we sat down a few years ago and we thought, we've had nobody come on this particular degree from the UK, so let's go out and ask them what they want. And when we did, we got a surprise. They wanted something quite different to what we were offering. And so we had co-development. So we would sit down with them and say, okay, just tell us what you want, and then we'll tell you how we can do that, but we also want you to help us deliver it. And so we would bring senior civil servants into the classroom to talk with us and the civil servants, the public servants, not just civil servants, but public servants. So that kind of engagement, I guess is the word. People talk about citizens' participation, but it's engagement. Now, I did say, I can't remember if you mentioned it, but I did say that one of the problems is that you need a degree of understanding and education to be able to engage with that. So a lot of the things at high level, you need people with a degree or a diploma. But there are many things you don't need people with a degree or diploma. Asking about the housing they need, asking about the education they want for their children, asking about flood control. These kinds of things, you can engage people in quite a wide variety of ways. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'd like to hear the two questions together then, asking the first, the gentleman over there, please.
Thank you. I'm Mishra from Hyderabad. We talked of, talent and parity. I was doing some work and I found in India, when you talk of public sector, it is 1:8 or 1:10. But when you take private sector in India, it is 1:500. And if you bring in, enterprises from abroad, then it is 1:5,000. So how can you get talent in public sector? Because these are limitations. We also have to remove limitations of pay, parity, promotions, the hard work they do, their recognition. That's very, very important to me, I think.
Can I take another question?
Okay,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Oh, I think you made a very important slide about Council of Europe defining 12 traits for good governance, and I think you said that they are meaningless in the sense that there are 12, and then they are too obvious to be any meaningful indicator. So, any research on what few indicators that can actually capture good governance in public administration?
Yes, if I answer the first question first. I'm going to have a cop-out here, and I'm going to be a coward, because you asked a very hard question specific to India. I don't know enough about how to do that. But my response, if I were asked as an academic, it would be, well, engage with the people who are most involved and look at the outcomes you want, and look at the barriers to those outcomes, and seek to reduce those barriers. But on a specific question relating to India, I can't give you a sensible, informed answer because I'm sorry, sir, I don't know enough. On the second question, remind me of your specific question. That was. Oh, yes, yeah. Yes, I was a bit disparaging of the Council of Europe, of course, wasn't I? Yes. I don't think I was hard enough on them, actually. There's nothing in there. I mean, what they're trying to do is to nudge people, to say you should do this. This will give you a good life. This will make you good government. But actually, there isn't an authoritarian government in the world that doesn't already say we do those things. And so you need to actually have it more as a narrative rather than 12 key points. Because if you give the 12 key points, people aim at hitting those 12 key points, or 10, or whatever it may be. OECD's got 20, I think, at one stage. And it's pointless. The narrative should be improving living conditions, reducing inequalities. Not all inequality is a bad thing. I mean, it leads to competition. So I wouldn't say everybody has to be the same. That would be foolish. That's whenever a society's tried to do that, it's led to all kind of harms. But reducing dramatic inequalities. So have a narrative. What is it we're looking to do? To make sure that, to use these SDGs from the United Nations, to make sure that every little girl has the same opportunities as every little boy from when they're born. To make sure that there is equal opportunity for people. And if there isn't, then you need to take measures to ensure, to improve their quality of standard. Security is always the main thing. Do you have, if people are frightened, my earlier point, if people are frightened to go out, then you've severely limited their life and their life chances and their enjoyment of life. So you need to have a good system of policing and justice. You know, that would be my key first one. Now, I know lots of people who look at economic justice would disagree, but you can't do anything unless people feel safe.
Okay, so I'd like to take the two questions from the front. So first, Pastor.
Thank you. Coming from United Kingdom, it is natural and obvious that you mentioned the principle of rule of law at the top level. But nevertheless, do you think that that is in substance an English or perhaps European principle or of global relevance? And if so, what does it mean? Just a formal method for positivism or some ethical standards, natural law implied?
Alexander,
Can
sorry, yes. I'm going to write this down because I've got several responses to him.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to know, I was curious, in fact, if during your research you have found any example of a system which really trains its public administrators very well. I'd be
Sorry, really claim.
So so once civil servants come on board, they also require to be trained.
Yes.
To be able to deliver in the system they are placed.
Yes.
Have you come across any system where you felt that the training was being organized very well?
Yes.
Oh, that's good.
I will.
That's good.
I'll go into more details in a minute. Okay. Can I answer those two questions?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Alexander, rule of law. Yes, as a lawyer, you're bound to ask me that one. I think there's a very different perception within the United Kingdom. It's changing now as it's becoming more American. The concept of rule of law dates back to very much in the German-speaking world, the Cameralist system, and everyone has to be trained in administrative law. The rule of law is at the top because that's where Guy BRAIBANT put it and where lots of other people put it, and they tend to be continental Europeans. It depends on the kind of law, doesn't it? And you can have a rule of law and be a very despotic leader. And so I don't think you can have rule of law on its own. You have to combine it with good governance and not best practice, but good practice. So that would be my feeling on that. Is it primarily a British thing? Not really. The continental countries evolved it. It reached its supremacy, I think, in the American Constitution because they wanted a government of laws and of men, not of kings and emperors. I hope that answers your question. To the lady there, madam, any system where I've been truly badly trained? Yes, of course, but I can't tell you here. Sorry? Well trained, yes. Well trained. It varies over time because when people do the training well, they tend to get complacent. The ENA training in France with the Grand Corps, when it was at its best, was very good indeed. But of course, the problem with it was that it drew from the elite of society. So you had other branches in society saying, "Oh, look at these Grand Corps. They're all from the Paris elite." So you have a question then: do you train people based on merit, their merit to get in and their merit to climb up, or do you try and get some kind of equal treatment? The UK civil service used to be wholly based on merit, but it was a merit where everybody was male and had a degree from Oxford or Cambridge and went to a private school. So that was good training, but you had to be privately educated, wealthy, and went to Oxford or Cambridge. Once you begin to expand that, as began in the UK in the 1970s and 80s and in France now, then you have to change the training. So I think if you don't change the training, then the type of training, the reasons for training, then you lose that excellence. There's one or two colleagues in this room that I've been involved with, and we're looking at putting together a national school of government for the government of Kosovo. Now, that is really exciting because only 2% of senior executives in the public and private sector in Kosovo are women. And the government is very anxious that we try and put together schemes that will ensure that we can choose merit-based recruitment and training in Kosovo. Because I'm sure that 98% of the most intelligent people in Kosovo are not all men. So we need to find ways of bringing forward and training those people. So although there's a good training system being put into place, it won't be good and of high quality until it brings on that talent that exists within that province. And that would be my guiding principle, I think, for, widely.
Okay, so thank you very much. So already 10 minutes past the time, so I'd like to close this session. And thank you very much for the provocative
Thank you, everyone.
presentation, and also thank you very much for the active participation. Okay.
Before we leave, we would like to ask the president of Iias to hand over a trophy to both the BRAIBANT lecturer Andrew Massey and the Prague chairperson Hideaki Shiroyama. If we can have... a round of applause.
Idea about address to the contemporary address. That's very interesting.
I found that slide and I thought that just says everything I want to say. But you find in any old society like Japan and Britain, you've got that warrior tradition, shogun. And,
right. They have their own kind of law.
Yeah, they're taken. Thank you very much.
And what is important is soft side.
Yeah.
And in our courses, whether it is management schools or IAS, civil service, we must have a part of
Break from the corporation. Break, right?